In last week's video, I briefly mentioned that the endgame scaling in Borderlands games is incredibly flawed. Gearbox keeps reskinning and reusing the same mechanics for every new game since Borderlands 2 and its OP levels. With Borderlands 4 coming around the corner, I'm hoping that they can introduce something new for endgame. Hey Vault Hunters, I'm Constant Canadian, and this is how Gearbox could fix Borderlands endgame. If you enjoy this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe as it really helps with the channel. And if you really enjoy the video, consider joining the membership program. 99 cents a month gets you a shout out at the end of my videos, as well as these cute emotes and awesome sub badges. And for $4.99 a month, you get all that plus early access to most of my videos. Before we start offering solutions, we first need to understand what the problem is. When I say there's a problem with Borderlands endgame, there are really two major issues I'm talking about. The first issue, which we talked about in last week's video, is the fact that our endgame levels, whether they be OP, Mayhem, or Chaos, are all just reskinned versions of the exact same idea that significantly increases enemies' health or damage reduction while giving the player a slight increase to damage. The main issue with this is that it is a very artificial way to increase a game's difficulty. Realistically, this doesn't actually increase difficulty, it just makes each and every kill take longer for the sake of saying the game's harder. There are a lot of games that increase difficulty simply by making enemies tankier, and almost none of them are actually difficult or fun to play on their max difficulty. That's not to say that a slight increase to damage or health is completely unacceptable, but say a 10,000% increase to enemy health does not make a game harder, it just makes the game take longer. So what could Gearbox do differently as opposed to just a simple increase to enemy health? There are a lot of different ways to make a game harder. The first of which is one that Gearbox already tried doing with Borderlands 3, Mayhem modifiers. And while Mayhem modifiers were certainly fun for the first little bit, they have a tendency to become incredibly annoying after the first hour or two, so that's definitely not a good idea for Borderlands 4. Another way they could try to make the gameplay actually more difficult is by increasing enemy stats aside from health, like reload speed, movement speed, or accuracy. These could certainly make the enemies harder. However, the problem here is that these bonuses could only realistically go so high before they become either game-breaking with movement speed, or become redundant in the case of reload speed or accuracy, as one can only reload so fast or be so accurate. I've also heard people say that enemy AI could simply just get smarter as we increase our level, and I think that this would be an amazing idea, but the problem with this is that Gearbox can barely get basic enemy AI right. So trying to make them more intelligent would be a struggle for sure. A really cool idea to make enemies more difficult is to actually increase their loot quality through the endgame levels, with each increase in level increasing their loot weighting to increase their chances of having higher quality gear, whether it be blue, purple, or even legendary. This would not only increase the difficulty through better damage, reload speed, and accuracy like I mentioned before, but it would also add a little bit more excitement during endgame, as some random bandit could spawn with a random legendary sniper and mess your day up. Enemies in Borderlands 1 and 2 are able to spawn with legendary weapons, and it always makes for a fun time. Now naturally, the legendary rate would have to be pretty low, around 1 to 2% of enemies, otherwise the game would just become a clustercluck of legendary weapon spam, and would end up the same way as modifiers do, being more of an annoyance than anything. But having enemies get progressively better weapons as you leveled up, starting with only white weapons and working their way up to mostly purples and blues, with a few legendaries mixed in, would make for a very good progression system that isn't just based around making enemies tankier. This would also bring back potential for another cool mechanic from the original Borderlands game, where enemies would actually drop the weapon they were using. If you came across an enemy using a cool weapon you liked, you could simply kill them and have a chance to get that weapon. Taking another note from the original Borderlands book, endgame levels could increase the amount of enemy spawns. It's not a constant increase as far as I know, but in Borderlands 1, during true Vault Hunter modes, more enemies will spawn. This was a super cool mechanic that I wasn't even aware of when I started my playthrough for my live streams, which, by the way, I stream every Friday at 8 p.m. and Saturday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on YouTube. You should stop by and say hi sometime. But it actually made the second playthrough far more challenging, as I actually had to take cover occasionally to protect myself from the onslaught of enemies headed my way. Increased enemy spawn mods are some of the most fun to play around with, and enemy density has been a point of critique for recent Borderlands games, so this would definitely be a great way to fix that problem. Now, this would have to be kept kind of tame, as I can totally see certain systems completely crashing out with too many enemies, but regardless of how they do it, Gearbox has to make some sort of change to the way their endgame scaling works, as it is getting very tiring having the exact same endgame mechanic in every new iteration. The next major issue for Borderlands endgame is the lack of true Vault Hunter mode, or more so its incentives. New Game Plus or True or Ultimate Vault Hunter mode is a pretty major part of Borderlands. At least it was in Borderlands 1, 2, and the pre-sequel. being essentially required to progress into the game's endgame. With modern titles, this feature is almost completely absent. I also mentioned this in last week's video. While True Vault Hunter mode is in Borderlands 3, it makes zero difference once Mayhem mode has been turned on. The only real difference between normal mode and True Vault Hunter mode in Borderlands 3 is that enemies will level with you and elements become stronger for weak enemies and weaker for more resistant enemies. However, once you turn on any Mayhem level, both those things happen regardless of your Vault Hunter mode. Now, in Borderlands 2, New Game Plus and New Game Plus Plus, also being known as Ultimate Vault Hunter mode, were a part of the main game experience, being required to actually begin the endgame. This is quite literally two opposite sides of the same spectrum. While I certainly don't think that New Game Plus should be an absolutely mandatory thing as it is in Borderlands 1, 2, and the pre-sequel, I also don't think there shouldn't be any reason to play it. The main problem with Borderlands 3's True Vault Hunter mode is that it doesn't do anything other than provide a second playthrough of the story. However, considering Borderlands 3's subpar writing, that's certainly not enough incentive. True Vault Hunter mode is meant to be a new experience with harder enemies and better loot, but in Borderlands 3, it's just the same game again. There are almost infinite solutions to provide incentives for True Vault Hunter mode. One of the most obvious ones would be to actually provide a more difficult playthrough. The original idea behind Playthrough 2, as it was called in Borderlands 1, was that it actually gave you the opportunity to play through the story again, but harder, with more focus on your character's build and gear. This is how it works in Borderlands 1 and the pre-sequel, and especially in 2, where Ultimate Vault Hunter mode is far more difficult than any other playthrough before it. Now, this can be done simply by increasing enemy health, but we already know how I feel about that. However, it could also be done by making tougher enemies that only spawn on that harder difficulty. That's something that Borderlands 2's New Game Pluses did very well, introducing armored psychos, scavengers, angelic loaders in places that aren't angel cores, and introducing super badass loaders, which are far scarier than their badass counterparts. Even just spawning more badass enemies could make True Vault Hunter mode more difficult. Another way to make the second playthrough worth it is by increasing drop chances for legendary gear. I know for a fact that a lot of people would be willing to play through the story a second time for even a 5% increased chance for legendary gear, even if it's just world drops it increases. Gearbox could also give us extra skill points for completing certain missions in True Vault Hunter mode. Throughout your initial playthrough of every game, you unlock certain equipment slots as a reward for completing missions, like your class mod slot, artifact slot, and third and fourth items. In True Vault Hunter mode, we should instead be given an extra skill point or two. Going back to Borderlands 1 again, the Claptrap Revolution DLC would reward you with a skill point for completing it on both the first and second playthrough. And that actually gave us incentive to play through that DLC twice. If True Vault Hunter mode rewarded players with an extra 5 skill points in total, it would definitely provide enough incentive to play the story a second time, while still not being so game-changing that players would feel required to do so if they don't want to. Another interesting thing that True Vault Hunter mode could do is the same thing that it did in Borderlands 3. Increase elemental reliance. I quite like the mechanic of different elements being better against certain enemy types, and I actually enjoyed having to switch weapons in Borderlands 2 if I wanted maximum damage, which thanks to anointments is kind of a thing of the past. I also know, however, that this is not the most universally loved mechanic, and a lot of people hate the idea of switching weapons after every kill, so this idea might not be the greatest. I think the most important thing that Gearbox could do for Borderlands 4's True Vault Hunter mode, if it has one, which I really hope it does, is make the differences unique to True Vault Hunter mode. Making normal mode on Mayhem, or whatever they're going to call it this time around, the exact same as True Vault Hunter mode with or without Mayhem on, was probably the biggest flop of all with Borderlands 3's True Vault Hunter mode. Now, there's also something to be said for the endgame content in Borderlands games. I may be biased slightly, but Borderlands 3's endgame content is some of the best in the series. We have 6 proving grounds, 2 takedowns, 2.5 standalone bosses, 3.5 if you count Vermi and Hemos separately, and 3 different slaughter maps, all of which are fully replayable. Borderlands 3 has almost the perfect amount of endgame content. Now, I certainly wouldn't complain if we had a few more takedowns and standalone raid bosses, but if Borderlands 4 follows suit with Borderlands 3's endgame content release cycle, I don't think we will have any problems there. Borderlands 2 did have an insane amount of standalone raid bosses which are fun to learn and take down, but it was seriously lacking in any sort of mobbing areas for endgame. For me, there is certainly a lot that can be done to improve Borderlands endgame for the 4th installment. Ideally, there would be a normal mode and a True Vault Hunter mode, with True Vault Hunter mode doubling enemy health as well as unlocking some new enemy varieties we haven't seen before. And to incentivize players to actually play the story a second time, we would get rewarded with an extra 5 or so skill points as well as a slight increase to our loot quality. Not to the point where we're at Borderlands 3 levels, but definitely higher than Borderlands 2. For endgame levels, they should definitely have to be earned rather than just given to you like they were in Borderlands 3. Now, DigiPeak was a neat idea, and it is honestly pretty fun. If they incorporated some of Wonderlands' Chaos Chamber's quality of life features like deaths not resetting the run if there's no enemies present, or just having 3 lives before the run fails, then we could realistically bring something like that back. As for what endgame levels actually do, naturally we should get some sort of increase to our drops, again nowhere near the amount there is in Borderlands 3 at Mayhem 11, but certainly a decent amount. I personally think there should be 4 or so levels, with each level increasing enemy loot quality as well as spawn quantities, with level 4 having triple spawns and enemies using mostly blue and purple gear. This would make the game significantly harder without just bullet sponging every enemy, and would make names like Mayhem mode or Chaos mode actually accurate, as Chaos mode in Wonderlands is anything but chaotic. Pearlescence should also definitely be brought back and added to various raid bosses' loot pools. To make farming these bosses less tiresome, we should definitely have a fast travel station available for each raid boss after the initial completion of their respective takedown or proving grounds if they're not standalone. In my opinion, this would be almost a perfect endgame setup for Borderlands 4, though I'm certainly open to discussion in the comments section. Do you think any changes need to be made to Borderlands endgame mechanics in future installments? If so, what changes would you implement? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you all so much for watching, have a fantastic day.